Alrighty, I'm here to talk about the host unification feature that me and a couple other developers have been working on designing the past few weeks. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So this is the design wiki page that we've created that describes our goals, our design, and then has some user stories with time estimates attached to them. So the idea that we could maybe narrow down the scope a tad to exactly what we want to do, and then just get started with it. Let's see. So I'll go basically just kind of through this wiki page. Feel free to ask questions using the Q&A app, or if you're on the Hangout, you can ask them verbally. So the main goal of this feature is to unify the content hosts in Katello and the hosts in Foreman at a model level. That is, whenever a content host is registered, a host is created. And by register, I mean using Subscription Manager to register, so that basically when you're viewing the hosts, there is always a host there for every single content host. However, for example, if via a Puppet check-in where something isn't registered, there may not be a content host for a host. And as part of a unified model, all the content and subscription portions will be based off of or hosted in the host object within Foreman. And then some secondary goals: create a supported API for Katello content and subscriptions. The current systems API is deprecated, but there's nothing to replace it. So it would be good to have a supported API for the future. Next secondary goal is to plan and implement a generic way for host objects to be split up and to be pluggable, so that, say, a host could have a Puppet aspect or a provisioning, for example, an image provisioning aspect, but maybe wouldn't have a content aspect, or may not have a Puppet aspect. So all of these things are sort of componentized and optional. Another secondary goal would be to migrate content hosts to scope search. So this would allow for searching for content hosts based on regular host attributes, as well as searching for hosts based on content or subscription attributes, such as subscription facts that are sent up from Subscription Manager. And then another goal would be to split apart the logic between content and subscriptions. And there's already a case for that in the current code base, which is hypervisors. It's somewhat hacky the way that it attempts to only be subscription based, even though the model doesn't really support it today. So this would allow for a host to be registered and only have subscription information, not have content information. And then our non-goal, which is something we are explicitly not attempting to tackle, is a unified host UI. There are mock-ups available for what that may look like. However, that's a much larger discussion technically, and it's just not something we attempted to cover in this design. It will be, or should be, much easier to talk about that and design that out once the model has been unified. So Shimon has proposed a design that would cover the way you would split up a host into multiple aspects. And he started a discussion about this back in March, I believe. And it was a pretty lively discussion. I encourage you to take a look at that. This is his proposal, expanded to cover contents and subscriptions, but is a bit simplified from that discussion, that initial discussion. So basically, a host would have different aspects to it, all of which are optional. It could have a content aspect, a subscription aspect, a Puppet aspect, and all of these things, if this design is accepted, this is basically what would be done as part of this implementation. We would split out the Puppet aspect and the content and subscription. And then in the future, we could split out the different provisioning aspects into their own aspect classes as well. There's also an aspect registry to know which aspect a host is using. You can see here on the left. However, due to scope search and simplified associations, the actual aspects would be associated directly to the host object. As part of this, we would also move host collections to use hosts. There has been some discussion about replacing host collections with tagging or moving host collections into foreman core. That's not really covered here, purely as that could be its own feature in and of itself. We didn't want to bloat this.
Hey, Justin.
Yes.
Not sure if others can see, but on the Hangout link, I don't actually see the web browser any longer.
Sorry. Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's all right. Thanks. Is that better?
It is. Thank you.
Okay, great. So yes, host collections would be associated directly to hosts. And in the future, a future team could split that out into tags, bring that into core, things like that. But the switch over from content host to hosts should be fairly simple. In addition, subscription facts would be implemented in a similar way to Puppet facts and Chef facts in the Chef plugin are today, in that the values would be hosted in the fact value, and then we would implement a subscription fact name class to differentiate the provider of that fact. If you want to see how that's done in the Chef plugin, feel free to take a look at the Foreman Chef Git repo. So the goal is to open a pull request with the Puppet aspect split out, and depending on how well that goes, hopefully it goes well, we could then implement the content and subscription aspects within Katello itself. If for some reason this isn't well accepted by the Foreman team, we do have a simpler fallback proposal that is very similar. It has some subtle differences, but is very similar, but just doesn't require the math, or I'm not going to say massive, but the refactoring within the Foreman core. And as I said, it's very similar. Some of the names are different. Some of the ways things are associated are slightly different. But you still have host collection on host. You still have fact value using the current fact infrastructure. The largest difference is just that there's no aspect registry, and that these different host objects are attached to the host directly. And I will cover real quick today the erratum, and the erratum is attached to the content host object. This would be attached either to the simplified content host object or to the content aspect. We currently don't store the list of installed packages in the database, but this would bring that into the database alongside erratum, which is there today. And then this was also discussed on the mailing list. If we are going to change the API and provide a supported API, and also if the aspect design is accepted, what would the API CLI changes look like? So we would basically base everything off the hosts API. This seemed to be the preferred approach based on the discussion that is linked on the wiki page. where you would basically fetch hosts, and you could specify different aspects to include. For example, this would include the content aspects in the index call. When fetching a individual system, you could include the content or the subscriptions, and you could attach multiple of these includes into the host request. And then all of the current APIs to manage things like triggering package installs would be based off the host API. And similarly for Hammer, we would, all the updates and whatnot would be based off the host class, and then the details would be modified to return potentially all the aspects of that host. These things do require an API to be added in Foreman to inject parameters into the host object, as well as an API to sort of register these different includes or aspects, and to point to which Rabble templates to include in those requests that request them. So the rest of this is just basically user stories, and we've tried to estimate these based on man sprints. Given a 20-point man sprint, these are broken down. They're broken down fairly well, and so there's a lot of small little tasks to do, and so hence the small estimates, just because there are a lot of tasks. And this covers things like either making the puppet environment optional, which it isn't today, or splitting out all the puppet concerns into their own aspect. It involves making sure that all the host, create, delete are dyne-flowed, not in Foreman core, but just simply providing a hook that plugins could hook into to perform backend actions. Migration of the existing content host model in Katello, and then just pulling in certain things into the database which are not in there today, such as facts, installed packages, registering with Subscription Manager via the different methods, via username, activation key, registering without a host object already existing, registering with a host object already existing. And then a lot of this is basically just ensuring that existing things continue to work, such as package profile uploading, the client actions. There will be changes to those, so it's just accounting for all of those, as well as being able to search by the different attributes. These are small little stories, but things that need to be tracked and accounted for. And we'd also need to cover, as hosts can be migrated across organizations, content hosts currently cannot. So there's a couple of user stories handling that. Let's see, where was that? Oh yeah, sorry. That's actually down here. Yep. I think. Anyways, then there are stories for example, hiding content actions if there's no content aspect. There's one for hypervisor registration via virtwho, only working with the or only using the subscription aspect, and then the UI needing to handle that and hide those options. Under the priority to, we mark this as a priority to purely because it is optional. The model could be unified, but this mainly handles unification of the API and CLI. Given that there weren't a lot of requirements surrounding this feature, we mark this as priority 2. It might be a very high priority 2. But we cover an API in Foreman to inject the parameters, as I was talking about, an API to define different Rabble views, and then the ability for the user to specify which views they want to use, and then migration of all the existing Hammer commands to the new API, basically. And so the assumption is that if P2 is not done and a new API is not created, and there is a user story for this, that the existing API would be converted to handle the new models. However, I think P2 is a pretty important group of stories to do, and provides a stable path forward for Katello and Foreman. And then some P3 stories. These were specified somewhat for the from the remote actions from user stories from the remote execution sprints or design that sort of relate to this. And it was basically that you wanted to perform remote actions based on subscriptions, which was a little odd. So we added these as a P3 to pull subscriptions and related hosts into the database. And it's a P3 because it isn't trivial, and it isn't high priority. We've deemed it not as a high priority. But that's basically all. We have, as part of this, we identified some provisioning attributes that were today required, and have already opened up a pull request and gotten it merged to make those optional when you're not in build mode. So the only thing left that would prevent host objects from being created today upon registration is the Puppet environment. And we do have a story for that, and there is a pull request open. But it was awaiting feedback for a while, and now it needs some changes to be addressed. So we'll probably continue working on that as the pull request for the aspect split out is opened hopefully soon as well. Are there any questions? I'll wait a second to see if there are any. Let's see. On the Hangout. I'll give it another, say, 60 seconds for any questions. And there is a thread covering this design on the Foreman Dev mailing list. So if you have any questions afterwards, feel free to respond to that. I believe it was called Host Unification Design or something to that effect, and was sent a couple of days ago. About 30 more seconds for questions. All right. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you watching, and just feel free, as I said, feel free to ask questions on the mailing list, and we'll hopefully have an opportunity to implement this design in the near future.